Hey, good morning. Man, last week's always a great reminder that He is alive and He's working in our lives and He's answering our prayers and He's moving and He's all about that, and we just give Him praise for that. We're moving back into our Intimate Living series for the next several weeks. We're talking about how to develop intimate relationships, ultimately with God first and foremost, but also with each other. And we're looking at roadblocks that kind of deter that from happening, as well as spending most of our time on building blocks, characteristics, traits that help facilitate that desire. We've looked at attentiveness and authenticity. We've talked about commitment, consideration, desire, and encouragement. And today we're talking about another building block called harmony or tranquility. And the roadblock is tension. Early in our marriage, and Susie and I have been married for 32 years now. Early in our marriage, I had a youth minister friend say, "Hey, Tim, do you want to go offshore fishing in the Gulf of Mexico?" And I'm like, "Yeah, of course. And who wouldn't want to do that?" And because we had a boat at the time, and I was fishing inshore, every 2 weeks or so, I was out there with somebody. And so he goes, "Well, this is going to be at night." I'm like, "That sounds great." And so we scheduled it. And when we scheduled it, it was about 5 or 6 days before we were going. Little did we realize that a hurricane would be coming through that morning. And so the hurricane came through. It was pretty much done by 10 o'clock in the morning. So we're like, hey, we're young, we're dumb, we're thrill seekers. We didn't alter our plans for that evening. And as we navigated out through the channel markers into open water, everything seemed eerily peaceful. And about a half a mile offshore, that's when the water and the circumstances changed from tranquil to quite tense. Flat, protected water became 4-foot breakers and a howling, swirling wind. The boat propelled up one approaching wave only to get launched into the darkness of the next. And with each occurrence, the hull just slammed down and just made this nasty reverberation, harrowing type of sound. Well, after 20 miles of getting offshore, making slow progress, when the Loran, which is kind of like a GPS kind of system, when the Loran went off and alarmed, we were on the honey hole. So within the first minute of arrival, Bob, who I was with, he dropped the anchor, he chummed the waters with his undigested dinner, and he said, "I think we should go in." And before I could even respond with, "Okay, that's fine," he started the engine, pulled the anchor, and had us headed back east. And in some respects, it was the quickest fishing trip I never had. I never got my line in the water. Well, as we were headed east, we were about 10 miles offshore, and we started noticing the lights. And things were different. They didn't look right. And as it turns out, we were 10 miles south of where we should have been. And so obviously, had we been looking at the compass was the only object in the boat with any sense, including the 2 adults that were in the boat at the time. The Loran obviously wasn't working. We weren't even on the honey hole, even if we were to drop a line. And we made our way slowly back north to the boat ramp where the gate was locked. And so we had to call the park ranger and convince him to get out of bed so that we didn't have to sleep in the truck till 6 a.m. Now, I mention all that to you because something really strange happened to me that night, besides all that. On the way out, and it never has happened before this time, and it never has happened since, but on the way out during that bumpy 20-mile run offshore, all I could think about was one thing. I needed to jump out of the boat. It was the weirdest thing. My mind kept telling me that the safest place for me was not in the boat, it was in the water. You talk about a Jonah moment. It was weird. I'd grown up fishing on the water, Mill Cove, Intercoastal Waterway. My dad and I were fishing every other weekend or so, but it was always in the light of day. Now, with the darkness and the waves and the wind, it all unsettled me. It messed with my mind. I couldn't see much past the rails of the boat with a shadow of a white cap busting here or there. And all I could feel and hear was this boat groaning in regards to what it was enduring. And as we were jumping waves and crashing down into the next one, my mind kept telling me, jump over. Well, needless to say, I did not jump over. I came back pretty dry and together, but But it did provide a very interesting night on the Gulf of Mexico with a subtle trifecta of tranquility that turned into tension, that turned back into tranquility. Have you ever experienced that progression? Was it over a long period of time, or did it happen very, very quickly? Now, what I want you to do today is I want you to think about that progression in terms of your relationships. Now, I'd be shocked if we all have not experienced this. It could have been with a spouse, a parent, a child, a friend, a boss, a coworker, a peer, even with God. Our stories are probably very similar, generally speaking. The specifics may differ, but generally, we share this. Everything is going along fine. Everything has been fine. Then we encounter a snag in the relational road. A surprise occurs. A comment is made. A moment that should have been remembered is forgotten. A memory that should have been left in the past is brought into the present. Instead of remaining silent, we speak up. Instead of moving on, we entrench. Instead of forgiving, we call someone out. And rather than looking the other way, we decide to harshly tell the truth. It can happen in a multiplicity of ways and in a snap of the fingers. And before we know it, we've moved from tranquility in our relationship to high tension. Now, it'd be one thing if all tension was bad, but that's not the case. Where do diamonds come from? Diamonds come from tension or pressure that's placed on a piece of coal over a long period of time. However, when it comes to our relationships, we tend to dislike tension, and we try to avoid it whenever possible. In your relationships, what has to happen to make the tension go away to produce the harmony that you once had? Now, I've seen some elbows, like, I always have to be the one to apologize. You never apologize. I am always the one apologizing. But that proves what I'm getting ready to say. Harmony is produced from identifiable moments, points of choice, points of action. Tension is released when forgiveness is chosen. Tranquility can return when we take our pride off and we clothe ourselves instead with humility. Restoration happens when we choose peace as the priority rather than winning the argument. Making the choice to live in a harmonious relationship where tension once existed is a powerful, powerful step towards intimacy. Now, today we're going to look at an event in the disciples' lives that displays this progression. Tranquility, tension, tranquility. And we're going to be able to, by looking at that, we're going to be able to discover a process, if we implement it, that will actually bring intimacy and harmony back into our relationships. The story's found in Mark chapter 4. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, talking about Jesus, "Let us go across to the other side," talking about the other side of the lake, the Sea of Galilee. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, which is the back of the boat, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" First, let's review this familiar progression. This event happened on the Sea of Galilee, and it demonstrates the progression we experience often in life when we move from tranquility to tension back to tranquility. The disciples had a pretty tranquil day. I mean, they had spent the day on the side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus was teaching the people. He used parables. And when evening had come, Jesus told the disciples about his plans. We're going to go across to the other side of the lake. And as they got in the boat, everything seems to be great. Tranquility continued to surround them. And Jesus, tired as he was from teaching, he falls asleep in the back of the boat. Now, if you've ever spent any time on a boat or on the water, You can imagine, in fact, if you listen very carefully in your mind, you can hear the sounds of that gentle rowing motion across the lake's surface with the waves buffeting the boat's boards. You can actually hear it. And at some point along that journey, that tranquil sound, that tranquility turned into tension. The wind picked up, the waves became violent. And while this disturbed the disciples, it did not disrupt Jesus. His body is like ours. He's tired, and so he slept peacefully, fully man, fully God. Now consider some of the tension points. We have at least 4 of the disciples that are professional fishermen. They grew up on this Sea of the Lake. They were very familiar with the storms. The Sea of Galilee forms like a teacup shape with the mountain range at the top of the teacup, with the bottom of the teacup being the lake. And so when the Bible says the storm came down upon the Sea of Galilee on the lake, that's exactly what it did. It crossed the mountain range and would drop onto that lake. It was an impressive storm. The disciples knew it, who were usually on the lake. But what was going to be even more impressive was what Jesus, the calmer of the storms, would be doing in just a brief moment. But here's a life application for each of us that we need to apply at this particular moment. Tension doesn't magically go away just because you become a Christian. If you are a Christian for longer than 3 minutes, you know that your life still has tension in it. Following Christ does not exempt a person from life's storms. The disciples were obediently following Jesus. They were in God's will. They knew what God wanted them to do. They were doing it. Jesus said, get in the boat, we're going to cross the other side. That's exactly what they did. We as Christians, we mustn't expect everything in our lives to be smooth sailing when we answer his calls, when we're in his will. Sometimes being in his will brings the turmoil and the peril, and the disciples knew exactly what that was like. In our lives, we've experienced disappointment. We've experienced sickness and sorrow and loss and grief, and those are all a part of life's experiences, whether you are walking in obedience with Christ or not. But here is the advantage of being on the Lord's side. He's with you through it. And that is a huge game changer. Why? It's because he is the same one that came out of the grave that we just celebrated last week. And so if he can come out of the grave once dead, now alive, having him in our boat when a storm is raging is of critical importance. And so through the temptations and through the tempest and through the trials, Jesus teaches us valuable lessons and he demonstrates his power. Tension can exist when Jesus is present. But here's the kicker. Tranquility is never far away when we're in Jesus' boat. So we got to make sure we're in his boat. Amid the tension, the disciples wake Jesus up. Have you ever been stirred like from a deep sleep to all of a sudden there is panic in the house? The laundry is just, the washer is spilling water all over the place, or the dishwasher's blown up, or something has happened, the dog's loose, and the person's right there in your face telling you what's going on, and you just come right out of a deep sleep. Well, here's the disciples doing that to Jesus. They're in panic mode. That's tension. They think they're going to die. That's serious tension. But it gets worse. They wonder if Jesus has stopped caring for them. That is magnified and multiplied tension. 3 words. That's all Jesus needed. And he didn't even need that, but he used 3. Peace, be still. Tranquility was immediately restored. No hour-long prayer service. Ever been to one of those? You're like 20 minutes into it, and I'm like, oh my goodness gracious, I got 40 more minutes. No singing of a 5-stanza hymn. Remember back in the 70s and 80s where we'd just go and there'd be another stanza and another stanza. No kumbaya. Kumbaya, my Lord. No kumbaya. They're not holding hands. They're not lighting candles, especially in a wooden boat. Not a good thing. Jesus calmed the storm and instilled sense of awe with 3 simple words. Peace, be still. Now, there's a helpful process in this progression in the story. When things move from tranquility to tension, since we can't simply control the wind and the waves, at least I can't. I've tried, but But since I can't control the wind and the waves with those 3 words, how about I provide you the 3 actions that are in this story to help restore tranquility? Here's the first one. You have to ask the important questions. When the tension was the greatest, the disciples, they fired off a question in Jesus' direction. It seemed to be the most important question in their mind at the time. It was this: Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? In other words, Jesus, we're going to die. Do you care? The question wasn't, hey, Jesus, can you grab a bucket and help us bail? Because you're just kind of snoring in the back. We need your help. It wasn't even, can you work a miracle? At the core of their greatest concern was whether or not Jesus was concerned about them. The disciples needed to know just one thing in that moment. In the greatest of tensions of their lives, Jesus, do you care about me? Not much has changed in 2,000 years, has it? Second, you got to wait on Jesus. Did you notice that Jesus never directly answered their question? Do you care that we're perishing, teacher? He didn't answer that question. He didn't say, well, you know what? I seem to recall a 3-point sermon that my father gave me once, and the first point is, he didn't go into that. He didn't say, well, fellas, you know I care, because remember that time that, we had 12 baskets of bread and fish left over from that, one miracle? You guys know. It's not that Jesus wasn't listening to their concern. I mean, the wind was howling, the waves were coming over the boat. He heard them loud and clear, but he chose, instead of addressing their question outright, he attacked the root of their tension. He rebuked the wind, he rebuked the storm, he rebuked the waves with 3 words: peace, be still. Can you imagine if the disciples would have responded to those 3 words the way the wind, the storm, and the waves responded to those 3 words? So often we don't ask the important questions when tension surrounds us, and then we follow it with another mistake. We don't wait on Jesus. We can create a mess for ourselves and for those around us by doing whatever comes first to our mind. Whatever the first thing is that comes to mind, that's what I'm going to do. Or if we do think of praying, we send up a quick prayer and we never wait around for the answer. Waiting is hard. It's hard, especially when you're in the midst of tension. You just want it over. I get it. It's hard. But after asking the important questions, we have to wait on Jesus to reveal his will. The third thing is this: we have to express a faith step. When the great calm set in and tranquility was returned, you'll notice that the disciples had their own set of questions. Jesus had his own set of questions for the disciples, and then they asked Jesus another one. Jesus' questions revolved around their faith, or better yet, their lack of faith. Where's your faith? Are you still not believing anymore? Well, they did, however, actually express a measure of faith after the tension was removed. But here's the kicker. We should be able to express a measure of faith even when we're in the midst of the tension. It's one thing to wait until the tension is over. Okay, the disciples had to wait. But when you're in the midst of the storm, that too is a perfect time to express a measure of faith. What were they filled with? They were filled with a great fear. Fear is an interesting word. It covers a wide variety of spectrum of thought. But the disciples, they experienced this fear. Their fear is best understood as awe, reverence. They had an awe and a reverence for Jesus. Who wouldn't? I mean, peace be still, and boom, it immediately calm. I mean, some of them grew up on this body of water. They knew, they'd seen storms come and go, and none of them have ever responded to their words. And yet Jesus says 3 words. He says, where's your faith? They didn't answer the question. Yet they asked a very appropriate question themselves. Who is this? Who is this that the wind and the waves respond? You know, the answer to that question has eternal significance, and each and every one of us has to answer that question, and will answer that question. Who is Jesus? Every single one of us, by the lives we live, answer that question, and it will determine where you spend eternity, your answer to that question. Everyone in that boat, every single one of those individuals in that boat and the other boats that were with them, their lives would be given for the answer, in a good way or in a bad way. So many questions can be asked. about this common earthly progression: tranquility, tension, tranquility. But our answers should ultimately lead to a faith step. Now, their group question as to who Jesus was signified a faith step for all of them except one person in one of those boats. You know who that was: Judas. Didn't change his life, but most of the disciples, man, they were learning that nothing was impossible for their Creator, and Jesus is the Creator. He's sitting in their boat. Most of them, they discovered Jesus was worthy of their faith, their trust, when their feet were planted on solid ground or when their backside was planted in a boat. They realized, they were learning that they could ask Jesus and he would answer. He may not answer directly the way they think he's going to answer, but he is going to answer. Jesus did care. Jesus is just as much in control during the tranquil moments as he is in the turmoil. He is in just as much control. Faith leads to harmony, and harmony with the one who can control nature can directly impact all of our lives and our relationships. And they were also learning that Jesus can lead us from turmoil back to tranquility. So you say, okay, great story, great event. How does this impact my relationships? How does this relate to intimate living? I'm so glad you asked that question. You need to ask that every time we talk about intimate living. How does my relationship with God, how does my relationship with others, how can they improve from this particular story? Well, we want to apply the process. What's the process? Well, first, you got to ask. You got to ask the most important questions. When tension arises in your relationship, you've got to think about what are the most important questions to ask. Does it really matter whose fault it is? 90+%, if not more, it doesn't matter whose fault it is. That is not the question to ask. But taking the time to ask the vital questions can center us in the midst of the relational storm that we face. Remember, the whole point of asking the right questions is to get to the right solutions. In other words, our answers will guide us back into intimacy with God and others. How about some of these care questions? Since the disciples asked a care question, let us ask a few. Do I really care about my relationship with this individual that I have tension with? Do I really care about it? Do I care about their eternity? Do I really care that as a Christian, I have the ministry of reconciliation? That's my ministry, and so I need to be reconciled. Do I really care about that? And outside of those care questions, there's lots of other questions that I can ask. Why am I angry with this person? Why am I angry with God? How does Jesus want me to respond? What can I do in this situation to bring glory to God? Boy, that's a good question. Why does the tension exist between me and this other individual? What's the root cause of the tranquility break? You see, asking and answering the right question ensures that we have an honest conversation with ourselves. And I said this almost from the very beginning of the series. You have to be able to talk honestly with yourself. You have to be able to have an honest conversation, and you have to be able to rely that you're telling yourself the truth. If you cannot have an honest conversation with yourself, you're in serious trouble. You need to talk to someone so that you can start having honest dialogue with yourself. Honesty will hasten your journey back to tranquility. You got to ask the right questions. Second, you got to wait. You have to wait. I know it's hard, but you have to wait. You got to wait on Jesus and his resolution plan. Jesus has a will for your life. He has a plan for your relationships. And he's still in the business of calming storms. He still calms those who find themselves dangerously close to a swamped boat in this relationships that we call life. But you got to keep your eyes open. You got to keep watch. You got to talk to him. You have to listen for his words. Now, you may not hear the audible words, "Peace, be still," but he is singing his peace over you and your relationships. Why? He's almighty. And if he can calm a physical storm in the middle of a Sea of Galilee, he can calm a relational, spiritual, mental, emotional storm that is threatening to destroy your relationships. There's power in those words. Peace, be still. Those words have the power to tame any storm that you are faced with that's destroying your relationships. Ask, wait. The third thing is you have to express. You have to express your faith. Once you know that you've asked and answered the right questions and you know what Jesus' plan is to work through the tension, you have to start restoring the harmony to your relationships. Work through the tension. Express your trust. Express your confidence in him through taking that next step of faith. That's what the Cove's all about, taking your next step of faith. We talk about it every week. And you may find yourself, you have to be the one that asks for forgiveness. You may discover that it's your move. You may discover it's not your move. Oh, you want it over, but Jesus tells you to wait on that other person. Oh, that's tough. I just want it over with. I want out of that boat that's filled with turmoil, and yet I have to wait. You may find it wasn't as complicated or as tense as you thought, but you have to be obedient. When he lays on your heart what to do, you have to do it through obedience. Your relationship with God, your relationship with others can improve and move back to tranquility, back to harmony. So what does it look like? It looks like this. Ask, wait, and express. And what we're left with is the same thing that the disciples were left with. When we do that correctly, we're left with awe. When we accomplish that process in the correct manner, it will leave us with a sense of awe for Jesus. And at the root of it, isn't that truly what describes intimate living? Awe for Jesus.